Wonderful. Happy Thursday, everybody. We are, I wanted to start today's class with a rendition of Jethro Tull's Aqualung in honor of Parshat Yitro, but not today. So later on, if you want, you can Google it and listen to it. But we are going to learn something interesting in relationship to Parshat Yitro about the question of miracles. And our relationship to them and how we might feel about them. We'll come back to that in a second. We're going to learn from Masechet Brachot, which is I'll put in air quotes, the first Masechet of Mishnah and Talmud. I put it in air quotes only because I don't really think the Talmud has much of an order. I mean, it does, it has an order, but the truth is that it's all so interconnected. Kind of like a Wikipedia, if you will, where everything is interconnected. Having a start in the beginning and a start and an end is really not so accurate. But all things being equal, it is really the first Masechet, and it talks about blessings. It talks about the Shema and all sorts of stuff. And blessings is and its relationship to miracles is what we're going to talk about today. Masechet Brachot is fantastic. It's well worth learning in its entirety, but we're just going to get a taste of it today. We're going to do a little bit of jumping around because some stuff I think is not as interesting as other stuff, and I'm excited for us to learn it. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. If I can figure out which page. Great. Can everybody see this? Thumbs up? Yes? Awesome. So we're not going to read the Mishnah that comes before this, but the question that we're going to start to explore is when we experience a miracle, what blessing do we say, or that we recite a blessing at all? And here you can see from Rabbi Steinsaltz, the not bolded part, that we presume an obligation. And the question that we are asking is similar to the ones we talked about in weeks past, where we say minayin, from where are these things derived? This is it's a phrase with a very similar, the same question but phrased a slightly different way. It says mina pane mile, which really, if we want to break it down, is mina is mean. It's from. Tine are these. Mile is like milim in Hebrew words. So from where are these words? And so the question is, how do we know this thing is true? From what source do we know it? And it's almost always going to be a quote from scripture. Can I get a volunteer to start us off? Read the first paragraph here of the Gemara. Anybody want to?
I can read. So with regard to the obligation to recite a blessing for a miracle, the Gemara asks, from where these matters derived. Rabbi Yochanan said, the verse states, and Yitro said, blessed be the Lord who delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. A blessing is recited for a miracle.
Okay, so we have two interesting things happening. So first we have this sort of, the Gemara doesn't tell us what we're actually talking about. Right? If we look at the text of the Gemara itself, it's the very literal sense. It says, from where these words derived, Rabbi Yochanan said, it comes from this verse, and then quotes the verse. So we have to draw out, Rabbi Steinsaltz has done this for us, we actually have to draw out the question in the first place, right? Which is there an obligation to recite a blessing for a miracle? And it seems like there is. And we can get from broader contexts that's what we're talking about. The second thing is interesting is Jethro, is not an Israelite. And so it's fascinating to see that we are being given a mitzvah, an obligation, right? A commandment here to say a blessing from someone who is not an Israelite, but in relationship with Israelites. And I just think that dynamic is so fascinating that it's not just about the Jewish people, it's about the Jewish people and everybody we interact with has an impact on Judaism. I just think that's fascinating. Let's read a little bit more and then we'll pause and we'll sort of unpack it together. Ron and then Sheila, I'm going to have you read the next paragraph.
When you said that, I was thinking about Bilam, Mika Mocha. We say it every single day.
Right. not only was he not a Jew, but his task was to
curse.
Right, it's to curse Jewish people. I think the phrase that we ascribe to him is "matovu," not "michamocha," but that's fine. Your point remains, which is that we recite it every morning. It's one of the first things we recite. Is this thing? And yes, I think there are probably lots of examples of it. And I just find that really, really fascinating. All right, Sheila, read the next paragraph for us.
The Gemara asks, for a miracle that occurs for the multitudes, we recite a blessing. But for a miracle that befalls an individual, we do not recite a blessing. Wasn't there an incident where a certain man was walking along the right side of the Euphrates River when a lion attacked him? A miracle was performed for him and he was rescued. He came before Rabbi, who said to him, every time that you arrive there to the site of the miracle, recite the blessing, blessed, who performed the miracle for me in this place.
Amazing, amazing.
And
Okay,
once
so sorry, before we get to Mar. All right, so we got an interesting thing here. The Gemara asks the following question, right? Which is, okay, the rabbis always want to know how applicable is this principle? Meaning to say, is there a difference between the circumstances of Yitro and the circumstances we might encounter? Meaning to say that the kinds of miracles that might show up to the Israelites may not really be applicable to the kind of miracles we've experienced. I mean, how many of you have seen a river split in half yourself? Right, not so many of us, if I will, right? That really is an important distinction between the miracles that are happening in the Torah and the things that we might experience. And so the Gemara is asking an important framing question, which is, what's the difference between miracles that happen between lots of people and something that happens individually, right? I'm also putting it on a time scale, but even still, the Gemara is asking the question, okay, if it happens for everybody, okay, that makes sense. We should recite a blessing. But something happens to us individually, should we not recite it? Right? This didn't happen to Yitro specifically. It was all of them. All of them were delivered from the Egyptians. And then we have an example. Wasn't there an incident of a particular person who was protected or saved from an animal, and he came before the rabbi, Rava, and Rava said, you should recite a blessing in that location. So it would seem to say that yes, there is a blessing to be recited in a particular context. Yeah, Sheila.
We do have a blessing though. We say a bench gomo, and we don't repeat it at the same site every time.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Maybe we may not, wait a minute. I take it, we may not have had the readings from the Torah, the Aliyot, at the time this was written. That would explain it.
I do think they have Aliyot at this time. But I think you're right. I think benching Gomel is, I'm not sure that a miracle is the same framework, but it's really close. I think you have a really solid argument there. I think benching Gomel is a great example. And you did identify there's an important distinction, which is benching Gomel is not necessarily in that particular location, which is being described here.
But you also do it once.
Right, you bench Gomel
after. Every time you go to that spot, I think if a miracle happened at that spot, I know sometimes we go to a spot where something good happened, where somebody proposed to us or something like that. We do remember it. We may make a comment about it, not necessarily say a blessing. Oh, this is a spot where we met before, or this is a spot where I first met you, things like that.
For sure. Yeah, so there's definitely some manifestations of this today, certainly. Yeah, David.
So I think the other thing that's interesting is that they're making this distinction between an individual and the community. Maybe there's something implied in the Mishnah that we didn't read, but that seems to be coming from some kind of assumption they're making that is, outside of our frame of reference, at least for now.
Right, meaning to say that the circumstances of multitudes and individual may have already come up at least once, and we just missed that context. Yeah, it certainly might be the case. I admit that I didn't go back and look and check to see what came up before. We could do it. I don't know if I have actually the whole thing here. Temple-related aliyot, the conclusions of blessings. It doesn't say anything specific here, but obviously the Mishnah started on the previous page, and I didn't include it here. But yeah, certainly possible. Certainly possible. Yeah, Ron.
Does the blessing for a rainbow fit in here somewhere?
I think if we're talking about this category, which is to say, is there an obligation to recite a blessing for a miracle that happened to multitudes? The answer would ostensibly be yes, and that a rainbow is an example. It's not a geographic location, but it's certainly a temporal one where we say, oh, this thing has happened, we should say a blessing. I think that would be a good example of this. Yeah. Nelson?
Well, Jethro, I want to go back to him for a moment because he was not delivered from Egypt. He was not a slave in Egypt. And he was a Midianite. And he's pointing at a blessing we say for somebody else. If we're part of the multitude, is that a different category?
You're suggesting, right? Even the language here, right? Blessed be the Lord who delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians. That perhaps what we're talking about is a blessing that we recite on a miracle that happened to others as opposed to ourselves. I think that is an important nuance. It's interesting. I don't know that the Gemara is making that distinction, but I think it's a good distinction. Yeah, Sheila.
Don't we have a special blessing for a rainbow anytime we see a rainbow?
Yeah, I think that's what Ron was making reference to. Yeah, Ron?
I know. I'm pretty sure there's a midrash that says that Yitro was one of Pharaoh's advisors. So we don't know when or if he actually left also.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the Gemaras we learned a few weeks ago, where Bilam, Job, and Yitro were each being consulted by Pharaoh. But I don't think that really happened. I think the Gemara was playing games. But yeah, I mean, certainly Yitro might have been impacted by the Egyptians in negative ways. But I think Nelson's point is well made, which is he was not enslaved. And when he was delivered, when the Israelites were delivered, he's not really in the same category. However, I would add the following nuance, which is Yitro's family was certainly impacted. And so it's not like he's so, it's still personal for him. And
his
really,
daughter. His daughter was, yeah.
Well, I don't know that his daughter was enslaved, but certainly his in-laws were, right? His machatanim and the
His
family.
grandchildren.
Yeah.
And his son-in-law.
Right. So, well, although it's an important distinction, right? That Moshe was not really enslaved.
He was not enslaved.
Right. So, but even still, there's certainly an association there. The other thing I was thinking about was especially with Hanukkah not that long ago and Purim coming up, is we talk about miracles, and I was thinking about the blessing She'asa nisim lavotenu bayamim hahem u'zman hazeh, right? So like in its time, right, is one, and then on the dreidel, right, right, neskadol hayasham, in a particular location, or po, depending on what your location is, right? That a great miracle happened there. We're talking about geography. It's a miracle happened in that location. And I think there's a lot of interesting things here. Let's read along a little bit further. Can I get another volunteer to read the story of Mar here?
I'll read.
Okay, great.
And
Right.
once when Mar, son of Ravina, was walking in a valley of willows and was thirsty for water, a miracle was performed for him, and a spring of water was created for him, and he drank.
Great, there's a little bit more. Read this next paragraph as well.
Okay. Furthermore, when Mar, son of Ravina, was walking in the marketplace of Mehoza, and a wild camel attacked him, the wall cracked open. He went inside it, and he was rescued. Ever since, when he came to the reeds, he recited, "Blessed, who performed a miracle for me in the reeds and with the camel." And when he came to the marketplace of Mehoza, he recited, "Blessed who performed a miracle for me with the camel and in the reeds," indicating that one recites a blessing even for a miracle that occurs to an individual. The sages say, on a miracle performed on behalf of the multitudes, everyone is obligated to recite a blessing. On a miracle performed on behalf of an individual, only the individual is obligated to recite a blessing.
Thank you, Jackie. What do people
Is
think?
it,
Yeah, David.
doesn't it
Let me
happen
come
that
back to you. Let me come back to you, Sheila. David, go for it.
So I'm noticing a couple of things here. One, and maybe this is why it bothers to say a valley with willows, unless that's literally a place name in this case. But both of these things, if you wanted to, you could think of as just a happy circumstance. Naturally, where there are willows, there's going to be water. He needed water. The spring seemed to be created for him, but maybe you could argue that it's a valley of willows. The spring was going to be there. He just happened to notice it. On the other hand, that's not that different than Hagar in the wilderness with Ishmael earlier. And then
I want to just pause. I'm just going to pause you because I want to read this note because I think it speaks to your thing, which is the Valley of Willows. This valley is well known in the Talmud as a desert, apparently along the route taken by caravans. There is no drinking water there, and only in certain isolated places where there are people selling water brought from the rivers. In addition, it was a place prone to attacks by highwaymen. So I want to say two things, and then I'm going to give you back your time, which is one, I think the literal reading of what you've read makes total sense, which is where there are willows, there is water. I think you're totally right about that. Second, you can see the Gemara is trying to make this story, or at least the note is helping us understand that at least in the eyes of the Gemara, there's some sort of, right, this is a place name as opposed to just a location.
So I'm going to react to that if I might.
Yeah, I think both reads are reasonable. Yeah, please, David.
But let me make the point about the second one, because even the cracking of the wall could be viewed as a happy happenstance. So maybe part of what's, at least for our generation, maybe what we can understand from this, because I'm not sure I'm going to accept that the Gemara considers the Valley of Willows to be a desert. I wonder out loud if it could have been the same thing for them as it was for me. And in between, to make it more of a miracle, sometime between 600 and now, 1500, 1400, sometime in the Middle Ages, somebody needed to work really hard to make the Valley of the Willows into a desert, but maybe it was a desert. I don't know. I mean, one would have to actually have some way of finding that out beyond just reading that note. But having said that, I'm just struck that it's all in how you look at it. So for some people, the 6-day war is, we had better armaments. They didn't. We had more, we were fighting more for our lives. They weren't. We won, they didn't. That just makes sense. And for other people, the 6-day war is a miracle. And I guess I would argue maybe it's both. I mean, you can have better armaments and it's still a miracle, because what if it had taken 6 months and a lot more lives, even not to say that no lives were lost to the 6-day war. But, you know, if you want to look at it as a miracle, great. If you don't, I guess you miss the miracle, but maybe it's both. Just a thought.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think using the example of the crack in the wall, it may be that in the intensity, he didn't notice it at first, and then it seemed as though it appeared, and therefore it was a miracle for him, right? It's a power of perception. But I do think there is a subjective quality to this that's important. Sheila and then Nelson.
It's we're talking about it being a miracle and a blessing being recited. They seem to be trying to multiply miracles and reasons to say a blessing. As I said before, I mean, when you hit a certain spot that you remember, you have to say a blessing each time, it becomes, then it's almost like you sound like some of these super Orthodox people who are looking, to count their brachot that they say each day. We're spending our whole time looking for miracles. It's like an obsession, don't you? Again, don't you have something else to do than think of all, in other words, if it's happening, you say, oh, you passed the spot. Oh, I remember this spot. This is a spot where this happened. Do you have to say a blessing each time? I mean,
So I want to push back in two ways. One is in some way, right, coming back to that spot and saying, oh, do you remember this really special moment, is in some way not distinctive than saying a blessing. I mean, maybe in a very technical sense, like I didn't say the actual words, but I'm not sure that that's fundamentally different than, like, let's imagine I using your example of proposal, right? So let's imagine Alana and I showed up, I ended up proposing on a hike. So imagine we did that hike and we showed up at the same location, and I looked at her and we caught each other's eye and I said a bracha. Like, is that really significantly different than, oh, do you remember this moment? Like, wouldn't we have ultimately done this? Wouldn't that experience be ultimately the same? So I want to push back a little and say, like, maybe we're adding too many layers of seriousness to it, to what a blessing might be defined as. And I want to say the second thing, which is, couldn't it possibly be that it's by a matter of perspective to say, like, life is such a miracle. Like, there is so much good in the universe. It's worthy of me to then mark it down, right? And that the world becomes holier because I've marked it, right? Like, place doesn't inherently have holiness, right? Like, things aren't inherently holy, right? Other than, like, human beings, like, creatures, right? And so that our choice to mark it makes it holy, makes it a miracle, makes that place of have weight to it, if you will. Again, I understand your point, right? That there's like a threshold where it's like, okay, we're doing this not for the right reasons. Like, I hear you. I think there's some, but I think there's more nuance. I think there's more nuance.
you also, I think there are two things. One thing, like the soldiers who went back to Normandy on D-Day, they go back, they don't say a blessing, but I mean, that was a miracle for them. But just going there, I mean, they have a ceremony.
Right.
So you want to say the ceremony is a blessing? It's a form of it.
Yeah.
And I think that also there is very possibly a generation difference. I think those of us who are older we realize our blessings more, but we don't articulate them the same way. Younger people, those who are, let's see, what can I say? Who are more spiritual. There are people who see the beauty in everything. Everything is done very carefully and with nice things. You wonder what they really think.
The only place I would push back is, I think, I'm not sure that that's truly bounded by age, but perhaps inclination. But I hear you're saying, or your point, which is that some people might be more inclined to that, like, sort of layer of intentionality, and others might not. And so I hear you. Nelson.
2 points. One is when I look at Christians and Muslims, they recite blessings for individuals, for Muhammad and for Jesus. We don't do that. And maybe that's really the point that the Talmud's trying to get at. We have a different package. But the related point, maybe, I'm not sure, I'm puzzling this. We all claim to have been at Sinai. Like, whatever miracles happened at Sinai included us because we were there. It wasn't just those people.
Therefore?
Well, I'm not sure what therefore is, but make sure that you say the blessings for yourself. not because of what happened yesterday, but what happened in the ahistorical past.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point, and I think our tradition would make those examples as well, right? What we're hearing about is the distinction between, ancestry and history and the narratives we tell about ourselves as a people, and marking those moments as miracles, perhaps, and also our own lived experiences, which are going to feel very different. And perhaps what we're seeing is a way of marking those as similar. Is saying, okay, we've got our collective narrative, which we mark these moments, and I've got my personal narrative in which I want to mark these moments. I hear what you're saying. I see that woven in here. All right, what we're going to do is the following. We're going to actually skip a bunch of this stuff, but I want to sort of get a taste of this next paragraph, and then I'll show you where it goes, but I don't really want to read it because I think it gets down into the weeds that I don't think is all that interesting. So the next section, right, is a Braita. It says, the sages taught in a Braita a list of places where one is required to recite a blessing due to the miracles that were performed there, right? So this is miracles to a multitudes bounded by geography, right? And that's sort of our context here. One is who sees the crossing of the Red Sea, where Israel crossed, and the crossings of the Jordan, and the crossings of the streams of Arnon, seeing a theme with those, the hailstones of El Gavish on the descent of Beit Horon, the rock that Og, king of Bashan, sought to hurl upon Israel. I hope all of you know where that one is. I certainly don't. And the rock upon which Moses sat when Joshua waged war against Amalek, and Lot's wife, and the wall of Jericho that was swallowed up in its place. On all of these miracles, one must give thanks and offer praise before God. So it's interesting, whether or not this is a true obligation, it's certainly telling us what these rabbis felt about marking these times and places. It's interesting, the Lot's wife part, right? Like, I'm not exactly sure where a pillar of salt might remain. And I'll skip it. It sort of goes through each one here and why this one and why that one. And one of my favorite lines, again, we're going to skip all this, was it says, there are miracles. However, Lot's wife, the thing that happened to Lot's wife is a tragedy. And what do we say in those tragedies? Blessed is the true judge, right? Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Right? And so maybe in part what we're talking about is not just happy moments, but also sad moments, and not just sad moments, but happy moments, that we're really marking, that maybe we're using this word miracle in really broad ways. I also want to say, because we're going to skip most of this, I love this. It says, the story concludes, it's just a few lines above, how tall was Moses? Moses was 10 cubits tall. So a cubit is 18 inches. So 180 inches, however tall that is. He took an axe 10 cubits long, jumped up 10 cubits, and struck Og on the ankle and killed him. My sense, and here I'll just do the math really fast. 180 divided by 12 would be 15 feet. Yeah. I've never heard that Moses is so tall. Good to know. But I love that.
Again, these are things like that. Today we have markers without saying the blessing. We have markers. This is where what's his name's house used to stand. And this is where the rock that Moses hit was. We do mark them without saying a blessing. Yeah, and even in Israel, you don't hear the guards say, the tour guide saying, let's say a blessing.
In those locations. Yeah, maybe they should. I would add, just when I lived in Pittsburgh, one of the most classic ways that Pittsburghers like to give directions, and perhaps this is broader, I'd only experienced in Pittsburgh, which was they always told you directions based on where things used to be. Not where things are, but things used to be. David, please.
So this may be my own hang up, so I'll just start by saying that. But every time I come to one of these sort of agadic things about, how tall was Moses or anything like this, I understand that they're probably putting that in there for a reason, but the answer is nobody knows, because nobody measured him at the time and wrote it down in something we still have on which we can rely, on the one hand. On the other hand, what this reminds me of, and I'll just throw this in I don't know if any of you have seen The Fabelmans, but Debbie and I just saw it the other night. And there's a scene in it where he's with his non-Jewish girlfriend who has a great big cross above her bed with Jesus hanging from it and all kinds of pictures of Jesus. And she's looking at these pictures as if she knows what Jesus looked like, even though he looks like in the pictures, like a decent looking Northern European fellow and not particularly Jewish at all, if you will, if there's such a thing. And he says to her, nobody knows what Jesus looked like. And she replies to him, well, he was Jewish, so he must have looked like you, and you're cute.
That was really funny.
That's
Yeah,
cute.
so I think I can't comment on the television show and that, but I do think there is a quality in which people want their, I'm going to use hero very broadly defined here, to look and be like them, right? We talked about that when we talked about that whole story of Abraham and the other their folks studying in yeshiva, right? That we want them to be like us. But here, I think we're making a different point, and then I'm not going to spend time on this because there's a piece of this I do want to talk about, which is, I think what we're talking about when they say how tall is Moses. First of all, we know that the Torah exaggerates in terms of like how long people live, and then we know that the Gemara will exaggerate as well, and certainly that's the case here. There's just no way that they really believe this. But I think on some level, what they're doing is they're saying, this is how great we think he is, and we're measuring it in height. Right? He was a towering figure, if you will. Right? We say that they have a towering intellect. Right? He is at 15 feet tall. He is towering. We are being told this is how great we think Moses is. Right? He is, almost 3 times our height. I think that's what's happening.
I absolutely agree with you, Rabbi, and I think that's what I was trying to imply if I didn't say it clearly enough. My problem is that some people read passages like this, and I studied with a few of them along the way, and they say Moses was 15 feet tall. Isn't that amazing? He was just that great. He was literally 15 feet tall because that's what the Gemara says. And if I say to them, I'm not sure that's what the Gemara means when it says that, then we have a problem, for better or worse. So I guess I'll just have to live with that problem.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to take it overly literally here. I'll tell you that. All right, I want to skip ahead. So it has all these sort of sections about these particular locations, these particular events that are being named. Talked about Lot's wife, that what happened to Lot's wife as a tragedy, and suggesting that there's still a blessing to be recited. It's not a blessing over a miracle. It's a blessing in this case over something bad that had happened. And then it has another comment, goes through that. And then it says this, which we're also not going to unpack because it's mostly just lists of verses. It says the following. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said. Does everybody see where I am right here? 4 must offer thanks to God with a thanks offering and a special blessing. So here we're getting another ruling, right? Which is that there are 4 categories of individuals who are obligated, right, to give a thanks offering and a special blessing, which is Rabbi Steinsaltz telling us this, but certainly that they must offer thanks. Arba'a tzrichin lahodot. And even if we just keep it as broadly, that these are categories of people who must particularly give thanks. They are seafarers, which interestingly in Hebrew is Yordei Hayam, people who go down into the sea. Those who walk in the desert. Those one who is ill and recovered, and one who is incarcerated in prison and went out. All of these appear in verses in Psalms 107. If it were me, and I was a betting man, and I'm not, this sounds like benching Gomel. This is the example I think, Sheila, you were sort of alluding to, right? Now we have Gomel in some way, right? People who are doing serious travel, right? People who fly over an ocean often fall into this category in modern, right? People who are experiencing the danger of sea, people who are walking in the desert, right? Dangerous place. Someone who has recovered from a dangerous illness, and someone who is in a dangerous place and was now freed. I think it doesn't say benching Gomel. I mean, it might later, but it doesn't here. But I think that's the sort of context. Yeah, Sheila and then Ron.
Isn't there a question that some people, when they come back from Israel, they bench Gomel? And some people.
My sense is that it has to do with an ocean rather than
Yeah.
Israel specifically.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I think anyone who crosses an ocean falls into this category in modern halacha of Gomel. Ron and then David.
I see the first two, the seafarers and the ones that walk in the desert. That's been replaced today by the traveler's prayer. It's any time you travel.
Interesting. Yeah. So here my sense is that this is after the fact. But you're right that it's not exclusive to that there's other ways. I'm not sure that the traveler's prayer is a prayer of thanksgiving, right? It ends with Shomei Tefillah. It's really about asking for them. It's a request. But I think you're right, which is that there are certainly blessings for lots of parts of the process, right? Who else? I forgot who was.
Yeah, I was next, I guess. I think Ron is right, but I think you're also right, if you will, because travel involves starting travel with some fear maybe, and finishing travel with some thanks maybe, and this sort of goes to where I was going to go before Ron made the comment, which is,
if both the rabbi and I are right, that fits right in with the Gemara that gives multiple opinions.
I think there can be multiple right opinions for whatever it's worth, but I think that part of it is just sort of what you're appreciating, if you will. I mean, somebody can go on a long flight, and the landing is good, get off the plane and say the pilot did a great job, or then maybe they'll even go and say something like, thank God the pilot did a great job. But if you're actually saying the traveler's prayer to start with and then benching Gomel afterwards, perhaps, you're really focusing in more on God, if you will. So I think that's part of what it is. It's part of it is focus and getting you to. It's no longer a throwaway line. Oh, thank God. It's much more intentional, much more thoughtful.
Right.
And frankly, it's some of us, I'm myself for sure, even though on paper or statistically, air travel is the safest form of travel, when I'm about to get to 30 or 40,000 feet or what have you, depending on that pilot in that little cockpit, I'm somewhat frightened, and I do say the traveler's prayer. And I haven't benched Gomel all that much after a long trip, I have to admit, but I have, I don't know, once or twice when, at least when I was with a group, and when the group got back, we all did it at shul the next Shabbos. There's a certain power to it, and maybe that's part of what this is, just intentionality and thoughtfulness.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to that question, right, of how we define it, which we didn't do, which is how do we define a miracle on some level? Yeah, Ron.
The interesting thing about, and I didn't bench Gomel for this, but I remember distinctly on my second trip to Israel, we went to Petra. And I remember when I came back across the border at Eilat, not literally, but figuratively, getting down on my hands and knees and kissing the ground. That's the one time I was so thankful to be home. You should excuse the expression. But I mean, I've flown a million times. I've never even thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, arguably.
Well, now that I raised my point, I'm afraid you're going to have to start thinking about it. No, I'm just kidding.
But what I was going to say was, on some level, right? I mean, car travel is incredibly dangerous. We do it every day, and we don't necessarily really talk about what a miracle it is that we survive that experience. And I have friends who work in transportation who don't use cars because they're so dangerous. And they take the bus, they walk, they use every other form of transportation.
What's interesting is I try to avoid elevators whenever I can. Of course, I worked for an elevator company at one time, so I would hear every horror story there was.
Yeah, as a person who has been stuck in an elevator at least once, yeah, I hear it. I get it. All right. So what this section of the Gemara does then goes and sort of gives categories. So how do we know that seafarers have to give thanks? And how do we know that people who walk in the desert? And how do we know? And it keeps going through all the categories. And then it says the following. The Gemara asks, Ma mivarech, what is it that they bless? What is the blessing that they recite? Rav Yehuda says, Baruch Gomel Chasadim Tovim. Baruch Gomel, right? Thank you, God who bestows loving kindness, which I think is great. And then it goes into this question of how many people there need to be around, whatever, which I'm not as interested in us focusing on. But I did want to point down, there was one other thing. It's this paragraph here. Can I get a volunteer to read what Rav Yehuda said?
And Rav Yehuda said, there are three matters which, when one who prolongs their duration, they extend a person's days and years. They are one who prolongs his prayer, one who prolongs his meal time at the table, and one who prolongs his time in the bathroom.
Okay. So here we have sort of in the same vein, right? We have this question of different folks who sort of get a benefit, right? A benefit from doing this, right? So we move. The Gemara goes from how do we know we need to say a blessing for a miracle? And here's some examples. And how do we, what does that look like? And here are some examples. And what is gratitude? Right now, gratitude and miracles are being interconnected here, right? How do we know that these things are in relationship? And here, by the way, I skipped it, right? Which is 3 people require protection from harm, and different things like that, right? And we skipped that. But Rav Yehuda says here are 3 things, right, that really protect us, extend our days and years. And I would argue that the reason why this is here is because gratitude is truly life-giving. That gratitude is truly a tool we can use to extend our lives. And I think in a very serious way, that's what we're being told. And it's being told in an interesting way, but I think that's the takeaway. And so here's the 3 examples, and it goes through each one. Yeah, Nelson. Well, I muted you before because you were making noise with your food. Go for it.
I apologize for my vulgar question, but when he says prolong his time in the bathroom, I prolong my time by reading on the pot. Is that what he means, or does he have something else in mind?
That was where my mind went as well. First thing first, let's come back to it because let's see what
it does say. Beit HaKisei, so that sort of sounds like it.
It certainly seems to say. I would point out that the types of things that he would have to read are not things he would take into the bathroom. But let's wait. Let's find out. So the Gemara says or asks, and one who prolongs their prayer, is that a virtue? Didn't Rabbi Chia bar Abba say that Rabbi Yochanan said, now the next page here, anyone who prolongs their prayer and expects it to be answered will ultimately come to heartache. Now, again, this is sort of in line with that miracle question. As it is stated in the book of Proverbs, hope deferred makes the heart sick. Similarly, Rabbi Yitzchak said 3 matters evoke a person's sins. They are endangering oneself by sitting or standing next to an inclined wall, which we talked about earlier this year, that is about to collapse, expecting prayer to be accepted as it leads to an assessment of one's status and merit, and passing a case against another in heaven, which we also talked about this year, as praying for heaven to pass judgment on another person causes one's own deeds to be examined and compared with the deeds of another person. This proves that prolonging prayer is a fault. Meaning to say, we seem to say here, this is a challenge. Okay, if you're praying, right, and you're hoping that it's going to benefit you in some way, it might not have the outcome you're looking for. The Gemara resolves this apparent contradiction. This is not difficult. And here we're going to get a distinction between the 2 circumstances. And you can see Hala kashya, this is not difficult. This, where we learned that prolonging prayer is undesirable, refers to a situation when one expects their prayer to be accepted, right? That's the circumstance we just heard from Rabbi Yitzchak and the Gemara. The other category that Rabbi Yehuda is talking about, according to the Gemara itself, says that prolonging prayer prolongs one's life, referring to a situation where one does not expect their prayer to be accepted. And how do we prolong the prayer? By increasing supplication. Meaning to say, these are not prayers for requests. These are prayers of praise, I think. I think these are prayers of saying, this is not a prayer asking God to do something for me, or even if it is, it's not saying, and it's going to happen, but rather a real sense that that we live in a world where we don't know that things are going to happen our way. I was just telling my parents about that story in the Gemara about the Purim, about the guy's head getting chopped off. Do people know that story? I'll come. The short version of it is basically the rabbis, two rabbis go drinking for Purim night. One of them kills the other overnight. In the morning, prays for a miracle, and the guy gets revived. The next year, the guy says to him, "Hey, we had a great time last year. Let's do another party." And the guy whose head got chopped off said, I don't rely on miracles. I'm going to pass on that party for this year. But again, in the same way, we're not expecting something to happen. Ron, please.
So I'm looking at this about not extending prayer. So that's a vote for shortening our services, right?
I wish I'm going to defer to
not only shortening the services, but shortening the prayers within the service, and dropping some of them because they're meaningless or repetitive.
I'm going to refer you back to your senior rabbi for questions like that.
There's also another Gemara, I think it is in Tractate Brachot, where a certain rabbi prays so extensively that he leads from one service into the next. It sort of begs the question, when is he able to do anything else other than pray the various services? But it's apparently very much to his merit, and the rabbis like it a lot, that he goes from Shachari to Mincha to Marav and back, because he's so intent on his prayer. I'm not sure where that is, but I think it's in Brachot.
I think the lesson here is about intentionality. It's not about whether or not you do a lot of prayer or a little prayer. It's about that you're doing prayers that are in alignment with values. Constantly asking and expecting God to do a miracle for you is not the right intent, is I think what the Gemara is telling us here. And so prolonging prayer is of value because I think in the end, we're talking about gratitude. This is in context of miracles and giving thanks. And being grateful is, I think, the takeaway. Let's keep going.
And was it last week? God, what's the word I want? Not challenges, reprimands, I guess is a good word. Moshe for standing there and crying out instead of moving forward. Yeah.
All right, let's read it because I want to get to the last two things, and then we're going to be done for today. As for the virtue of prolonging one's mealtime at the table, which Rabbi Yehuda mentioned, the Gemara explains, perhaps a poor person will come during the meal, and the host will be in a position to give them food immediately, without forcing the poor person to wait. The sages elsewhere praised a person who acts appropriately at a meal, as it is written, the altar 3 cubits high, and the length thereof 2 cubits was of wood, and so the corners thereof, and the length thereof, and the walls thereof were also of wood, from Ezekiel. And it's written in the continuation of the verse, and he said unto me, this is the table that is before the Lord. The language of this verse is difficult, as it begins with the altar and concludes with the table. Rather, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar both say, as long as the temple stood, the altar atoned for Israel's transgressions. Now that it is destroyed, a person's table atones for one's transgressions. Meaning to say that prolonging one's mealtime at the table gives us an opportunity to be generous. And generosity is something that prolongs one's life. So now we have gratitude, we have generosity, we have living a life without expectation that God's going to do things for you, right? And I think in line with what Ron was just saying, right, that you have to take action on your own. And here we have the context, right, that our table is really a temple of our own, in our own case. And here, lastly, the question of the bathroom. with regard to Rabbi Yehuda and said in praise of one who prolongs their time in the bathroom, the Gemara asks, is that a virtue? Good, we should challenge our own assumptions here. Wasn't it taught in a Braita? 10 things bring a person to suffer from hemorrhoids. One who eats the leaves of bulrushes, grape leaves, tendrils of grapevines, the palate and the tongue of an animal, as well as any other part of the animal which is not smooth and which has protrusions, the spine of a fish, the salty fish that is not cooked, and one who drinks wine dregs, and one who wipes themselves with lime and clay, the materials from which earthenware is made, and one who wipes themselves with a stone with which another person wipes themselves. Some say one who suspends themselves too much time in the bathroom as well. This proves that prolonging one's time in the bathroom is harmful, meaning to say, rabbis, I wouldn't, look, don't take this as medical advice, but certainly to say that spending too much time in the bathroom has a counter, not necessarily always good. And so how does the Gemara respond? The Gemara responds, this is not difficult. This Baraita, which teaches that doing so is harmful, refers to one prolongs their time there and suspends themselves, while the statement of Rabbi Yehuda refers to one prolongs their time there and does not suspend themselves. And I think we're talking about like physical holding your body up is what I think they're telling us. Meaning to say, if you're putting yourself into a physical position to be harmed, right, where you're holding yourself in a strange way, again, bathrooms not being exactly the same, that we have an example. We have a story here which we're not going to read, and then it goes on to other kinds of things, sort of the opposite. And so what I want to say, sort of by way of conclusion for today's learning, which is to say, first of all, we ended in a very silly place. Let's just name that talking about bathroom practices is a very silly place to end a Gemara class. But I think the broader point here is telling us the journey we just took from, miracles that happened to the Jewish people to the miracles that happen in our bodies, right? And we do use that language when we talk about Asher Yatzar, right? That we're really talking about the whole gamut of our entire lives and how many miracles are really happening to us. They happen in places, they happen in times, they happen to our bodies, they happen to our hearts, that there are so many places to show gratitude, to mark special moments, right? Using the examples that Sheila was giving, right? That happen to us personally and happen to us as people, as a people. And that not only is this gratitude valuable in its own way, but that it has the power to prolong our lives. And I truly believe that gratitude and a positive outlook has physical benefits, like real physical benefits. And so I sort of bring us to conclusion to say that I think the halacha that we're learning here about obligation is really about reminding us that gratitude matters, that the intentionality to say, you know what, there are good things in my life, that there are things to be thankful for. I'm going to thank God for them. I'm not going to be expectant of God to just do things for me, but that things do happen and we can mark them. And maybe not everything is in the category, a hard boundary category of miracles. Not everything is a sea splitting, but that our world is really truly full of miracles. We just have to keep our eyes open for them. And I think that's the power of this week's sugya and what we learned today. And just a good opportunity to express my own gratitude to all of you for learning Gemara with me every week. I'll take this opportunity to say thank you for that. Any last thoughts before we conclude for the day? Anything anyone wants to share? Doesn't have to be about the class. I mean, about the sugya. Okay. Well, with that in mind, have a wonderful Shabbat. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next week.